Here is Sailor Studio 260, and this is a bright kind of lime green that in general is lighter than we see in the swatch. In fact, the swatch shows areas much darker than I see ever in the writing sample. There is a little bit of tone shift as papers change, and it does manage to shade on every paper. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performs generally well, but you will see a bleed spot under a reasonable circumstance. Otherwise, this isn't aggressive and would be a good choice for student note takers, depending on the paper of preference. This would be a good ink for a second color on the page, as a full page might be a bit too much for the eyes. And with that, I am happy to have a sample of it, but I wouldn't be looking for a bottle.
The pen for today is a Sailor My First Pen. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we really see that bright lime green on the page standing out well against the bright white Clairfontaine paper. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade, and it shades well just because it's light and going to a bit darker. It's not huge and stand out as the thing. Look at called on the second line, where the A is a little bit darker than the letters around it. It lightens up a little bit, gets a little darker with the ED at the end. It's giving it more credit for shading than it deserves, but this underneath it, the his at the end is much darker than the T, but that word tends to be much darker than everything around it. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Sailor makes more than one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Sailor.
Here is Sailor Manyo Yamabuki. Here is Sailor Yozakura. Here is Sailor Studio 027. Here is Sailor Studio 230.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Now, it doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does shade better than it did on the Clairfontaine. The more absorbent paper really worked in its benefit, making it much easier to read here with a whole lot more shading going on. Where in the Clairfontaine, the shading tend to be much gentler from a light to a lighter midtone. Here we get a lot more of the darker tones and a lot more shifting back and forth from the medium and darker tone. Beautiful in its execution. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here in general, I think the tone is just a little bit darker than it is on the Clairfontaine. That leads me to believe that this is not opaque. This is not translucent. This is not being affected by the tone of the paper, but by the makeup of the paper, that the composition itself makes the ink a little bit darker. So we have an opaque ink affected by the paper, not the tone. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, does shade as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, showing a bit more of the darker tones in what's going on, not shading as well as what we saw in the Portage just before. Looking at the back of the page, we don't really have a bleed problem. We have a bleed spot that occurred, just to point that out, but otherwise we don't have any kind of over-penetration or any kind of shading. So I mark it because it's there, but I think it was kind of a freak show of a moment.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, shades the same as the Clairfontaine. Most importantly, how does it do against the quad rule? I don't think very well. I don't think it really manages to stand out well against the quad rule, really just because of how bright a green this is. So for me, this would not be a good ink to use on this type of paper. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more green inks. Here is Diamine Green Black. Here is Geherban Vert Empire. Here is KWZ Menthol Green. Here is Organic Studios James Joyce Hunter Green. All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here the tone is lighter, is flatter than we got on the Clairfontaine, just not as vivid, that lime green. And that lighter tone isn't helping it. Now, it doesn't feather, doesn't spread, does shade, not as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. More important, it really isn't standing out well against this quad rule. I don't see this as being a great ink for a student to use in their note-taking, though it might make a good second color on a page to add to some of those notes. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page. Here is Monteverde Motivation. Here is Lamy Violet.
Here is Noodler's Heart of Darkness.
Here is Roeder and Klinger Alt Bordeaux. The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here the tone is just a little bit darker than it is on the Clairfontaine. We don't really have a problem when it comes to feathering. We don't have very much spread at all, really showing this to be a great ink for on copy paper. I think the muted white of the copy paper is really working to the advantage here. It does shade very well, like you see with intersections. Now, most of what you're getting is going to be really not as much shading as that, like now on the third line, where the N is a little bit darker than the OW at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, making this an excellent ink for 20-pound copy paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The medium flow, medium fine nib of the Sailor My First Pen gives a light lime green tone with plenty of shading. Off camera, I tried this in a wet broad, and the tone darkened a lot, but still not to the point of the swatch, and it still shaded really well. I would say go for that darker tone. It's more usable, so I go for a wet pen. I say any standard nib size for a mid-tone lime green with shading, though me personally, I probably go with a very wet fine or more likely a very wet medium to be able to show off a little bit more of the shading.